Three Tales from Otherness by David Brin. Otherness is a collection of the author's short stories published in 1994, but including some work from the previous decade, which first appeared elsewhere. The first, called The Warm Space, was originally published in Far Frontiers, a 1985 anthology. Then another anthology the same year called Great Science Fiction, Stories by the World's Greatest Scientists. Then again in 1989 with a third entitled Robots. The second story is called Bubbles and first appeared in an anthology called The Universe in 1987. The third, entitled Ambiguity, was originally published in a 1989 anthology called The Microverse, and then another in 1990 called Earth. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Warm Space. 1. Jason Forbes, S62B, 129876 RD, Biohuman, reported once to Project Lightprobe for immediate assumption of duty as designated oral witness engineer, by order of director. Jason let the flimsy message slip from his fingers, fluttering in the gentle centrifugal pseudo-gravity of the station apartment. Coriolis force, or perhaps the soft breeze from the wall vents, caused it to drift past the edge of the table and land on the floor of the small dining nook. "Are you going to go?" Elaine asked nervously from Jessie's crib, where she had just put the baby down for a nap. Wide eyes made plain her fear. "What choice do I have?" Jason shrugged. "My number was drawn. I can't disobey. Not the way the Utilitarian Party has been pushing its weight around. Under the Required Services Act, I'm just another motile, sentient unit of some small use to the state." That was true as far as it went. Jason did not feel it necessary to add that he had actually volunteered for this mission. There was no point. Elaine would never understand. A woman with a child doesn't need to look for justifications for her existence, Jason thought as he gathered what he would need from the closet. But I'm tired of being an obsolete token representative of the old race, looked down upon by all the sleek new types. At least this way my kid may be able to say his old man had been good for something, once. It might help Jesse hold his head up in the years to come. Years sure to be hard for the old style of human being. He zipped up his travel suit, making sure the vac-tight ankle and wrist fastenings. Elaine came to him and slipped into his arms. "You could try to delay them," she suggested without conviction. "System-wide elections are next month. The ethicalists and the naturalists have declared a united campaign." Jason stroked her hair, shaking his head. Hope was deadly. They could not afford it. "It's no use, Elaine. The utilitarians are completely in charge out here at the station, as well as nearly everywhere else in the solar system. Anyway, everyone knows the election is a foregone conclusion." The words stung, but they were truthful. On paper, it would seem there was still a chance for a change. Biological humans still outnumbered the mechanical and cyborg citizen types, and even a large minority of the latter had misgivings about the brutally logical policies of the Utilitarian Party. But only one biological human in 20 bothered to vote anymore. There were still many areas of creativity and skill in which mechano-cryo citizens were no better than organics, but a depressing conviction weighed heavily upon the old type. They knew they had no place in the future. The stars belonged to the other varieties, not to them. I've got to go. Gently, Jason peeled free of Elaine's arms. He took her face in his hands and kissed her one last time, then picked up his small travel bag and helmet. Stepping out into the corridor, he did not look back to see the tears that he knew were there, laying soft, saltwater history down her face. 2. The quarters for biological human beings lay in the old wheel, a part of the research station that had grown ever shabbier as old-style scientists and technicians lost their places to models better suited to the harsh environment of space. Once, back in the days when mechano-cryo citizens were rare, the old wheel had been the center of excited activity here beyond the orbit of Neptune. The first starships had been constructed by clouds of space-suited humans, like tethered bees swarming over mammoth hives. Giant slow boats, restricted to speeds far below that of light, had ventured forth from here into the interstellar night. That had been long ago, when organic people had still been important, but even then there were those who had foreseen what was to come. Nowhere were the changes of the last century more apparent than here at Project Light Probe. The old type now only served in support roles, few contributing directly to the investigations, perhaps the most important in human history. Jason's vac sled was stored in the old wheel's North Hub airlock. Both sled and suit checked out well, but the creaking outer doors stuck halfway open when he tried to leave. He had to leap over with a spanner and pound the great hinges several times to get them unfrozen. The airlock finally opened in fits and starts. Frowning, he remounted the sled and took off again. The old wheel gets only scraps for maintenance, he thought glumly. Soon there'll be an accident, and the utilitarians will use it as an excuse to ban organic humans from every research station in the solar system. The old wheel fell behind as short puffs of gas sent his sled toward the heart of the research complex. For a long time, he seemed to ride the slowly rotating wheel's shadow, eclipsing the dim glow of the distant sun. From here, Earth home was an invisible speck. Few ever focused telescopes on the old world. Everyone knew that the future wasn't back there, but out here and beyond, with the innumerable stars covering the sky. Gliding slowly across the gulf between the old wheel and the complex, Jason had plenty of time to think. Back when the old slow boats had set forth from here to explore the nearest systems, it had soon become apparent that only mechanicals and cyborgs were suited for interstellar voyages. Asteroid-sized arcs, artificial worldlets capable of carrying entire ecospheres, remained a dream out of science fiction, economically beyond reach. Exploration ships could be sent much farther and faster if they did not have to carry the complex artificial environments required by old-style human beings. By now, 10 nearby stellar systems had been explored, all by crews consisting of robo-humans. There were no plans to send any other kind, even if, or when, Earth-like planets were discovered. It just wouldn't be worth the staggering investment required. That fact, more than anything else, had struck at the morale of biological people in the solar system. The stars, they realized, were not for them. Resignation led to a turning away from science and the future. Earth and the dirt colonies were apathetic places these days. Utilitarianism was the guiding philosophy of the times. Jason hadn't told his wife his biggest reason for volunteering for this mission. He was still uncertain he understood it very well himself. Perhaps he wanted to show people that a biological citizen could still be useful and contribute to the advance of knowledge, even if it were by a task so humble as a suicide mission. He saw the lightship ahead, just below the shining spark of Sirius, a jet-black pearl half a kilometer across. Already he could make out the shimmering of its fields as its mighty engines were tuned for the experiment ahead. The technicians were hoping that this time it would work, but even if it failed again, they were determined to go on trying. Faster-than-light travel was not something anyone gave up on easily, especially a robot with a lifespan of 500 years. The dream and the obstinacy to pursue it was a strong inheritance from the parent race. Next to the black experimental probe with its derricks and workshops was the towering bulk of the central cooling plant, by far the largest object in the complex. Jason's rickety vac sled puffed beneath a majestic globe, shining in the sky like a great silvery planet. On this, the side facing the sun, the cooling globe's reflective surface was nearly perfect. On the other side, a giant array of fluid-filled radiators stared out onto intergalactic space, chilling liquid helium down to the basic temperature of the universe, a few degrees above absolute zero. The array had to stare at the blackness between the galaxies. Faint sunlight, even starlight, would heat the cooling fluid too much. That was the reason for the silvery reflective backing. The amount of infrared radiation leaving the finned coolers had to exceed the few photons coming in order for the temperature of the helium to drop far enough. The new types of citizens might be faster and tougher, and in some ways smarter, than old-style humans. They might need neither food nor sleep, but they did require a lot of liquid helium to keep their supercooled, superconducting brains humming. The shining, well-maintained cooling plant was a reminder of the priorities of the times. Some years back, an erratic biohuman had botched an attempt to sabotage the cooling plant. All it accomplished was to have the old style banished from that part of the station, and some mechano-cryo staff members who had previously been sympathetic with the ethicalist cause switched to utilitarianism as a result. The mammoth sphere passed over and behind Jason. In moments, there was only the lightship ahead, shimmering within its cradle of spotlit gantries. A voice cut in over his helmet speaker in a sharp monotone. "Attention approaching biological. You are entering a restricted zone. Identify yourself at once." Jason grimaced. The station director had ordered all mechano personnel, meaning just about everybody left, to reprogram their voice functions along, quote, more logical tonal lines, end quote. That meant they no longer mimicked natural human intonations, but spoke in a new, shrill whine. Jason's few android and cyborg friends, colleagues on the support staff, had whispered their regrets, but those days it was dangerous to be in the minority. All soon adjusted to the new order. Jason Forbes, identifying self. He spoke as crisply as possible, mimicking the toneless utilitarian dialect. He spelled his name and gave his ident code. Oral witness, engineer for Project Light Probe, reporting for duty. There was a pause, then the unseen security overseer spoke again. Cleared and identified Jason Forbes. Proceed directly to Slip 9, Scaffold B. Escorts await your arrival. Jason blinked. Had the voice softened perceptibly? A closet ethicalist, perhaps, out here in this utilitarian stronghold? Success and an operative return are approved outcomes, the voice added, hesitantly, with just a hint of tonality. Jason understood utilitarian dialect well enough to interpret the simple good luck wish. He didn't dare thank the fellow, whoever he might be, whatever his body form, but he appreciated the gesture. Acknowledged, he said, and switched off. Ahead, under stark shadows cast by spotlights girdling the starship, Jason saw at least a dozen scientists and technicians waiting for him by a docking slip. One or two of the escorts actually appeared to be fidgeting as he made his final maneuvers into the slot. They came in all shapes and sizes. Several wore little globe-bot bodies. Spider forms were also prominent. Jason hurriedly tied the sled down, almost slipping as he secured his magnetic boots to the platform. He knew his humaniform shape looked gawky and unsuited to this environment, but he was determined to maintain some degree of dignity. "Your ancestors made these guys," he reminded himself. "And old-style people built this very station. We're all citizens under the law, from the director down to the janitor bot, all the way down to me." Still, he felt awkward under their glistening camera eyes. "Come quickly, Jason Forbes." His helmet speaker whined, and a large mechanical form gestured with one slender, articulated arm. "There is little time before the test begins. We must instruct you in your duties." Jason recognized the favorite body form of the director, an anti-biological utilitarian of the worst sort. The machine scientist swiveled at the hips and rolled up the gangplank. Steam-like vapor puffed from vents in the official's plasteel carapace. It was an ostentatious display to release evaporated helium that way. It demonstrated that the assistant director could keep his circuits as comfortably cool as anybody's and hang the expense. An awkward human in the midst of smoothly gliding machines, Jason glanced backward for what he felt sure would be his last direct view of the universe. He had hoped to catch a final glimpse of the old wheel, or at least the sun. But all he could see was the great hulk of the cooling plant, staring out into the space between the galaxies, keeping cool the lifeblood of the apparent inheritors of the solar system. The director called again, impatiently. Jason turned and stepped through the hatch to be shown his station and his job. 3. You will remember not to touch any of the controls at any time. The ship's operation is automatic. Your function is purely to observe and maintain a running oral monologue into the tape recorder. The director sounded disgusted. I will not pretend that I agree with the decision to include a biological entity in this experiment. Perhaps it was because you are expendable, and we have already lost too many valuable mechano-persons in these tests. In any event, the reasons are not of your concern. You are to remain at your station, leaving only to take care of... The voice lowered in distaste, and the shining cells of the official's eyes looked away. To take care of bodily functions. A refresher unit has been installed behind that hatchway. Jason shrugged. He was getting sick of the pretense. Wasn't that a lot of expense to go to? I mean, whatever's been killing the silicon and cyborg techs who rode the other ships is hardly likely to leave me alive long enough to get hungry or to go to the bathroom. The official nodded, a gesture so commonly used that it had been retained even in utilitarian fashion. We share an opinion, then. Nevertheless, it is not known at what point in the mission the malfunctions occur. The minimum duration in hyperspace is 15 days. The engines cannot cut the span any shorter. After that time, the ship emerges at a site at least 5 light years away. It will take another 2 weeks to return to the solar system. You will continue your running commentary throughout that period, if necessary, to supplement what the instruments tell us. Jason almost laughed at the ludicrous order. Of course he would be dead long before his voice gave out. The techs and scientists who went out on the earlier tests had all been made of tougher stuff than he, and none of them had survived. Until a year ago, none of the faster-than-light starships had even returned. Some scientists had even contended that the theory behind their construction was in error somehow. At last, simple mechanical autopilots were installed, in case the problem had to do with the crews themselves. The gamble paid off. After that, all the ships returned, filled with corpses. Jason had only a rough impression of what had happened to the other expeditions, all from unreliable scuttlebutt. The official story was still a state secret, but rumor had it that the prior crews had all died of horrible violence. Some said they had apparently gone mad and turned on each other. Others suggested that the fields that drove the ship through that strange realm known as hyperspace twisted the shapes of things within the ship, not sufficiently to affect the cruder machines, but enough to cause the subtle cryogenic circuitry of the scientists and techs to go haywire. One thing Jason was sure of: anything that could harm mechano-cryos would easily suffice to do in a biological. He was resigned, but all the same determined to do his part. If some small thing he noticed and commented on into the tape machine led to a solution, maybe some little thing missed by all the recording devices, then Terran civilization would have the stars. That would be something for his son to remember, even if the true inheritors would be human machines. "All right," he told the director. "Take this bunch of gawkers with you and let's go on with it." He strapped himself into the observer's chair behind the empty pilot's seat. He did not even look up as the technicians and officials filed out and closed the hatch behind them. 4. In the instant after launching, the lightship made an eerie trail across the sky. Cylindrical streaks of pseudo-Cherenkov radiation lingered long after the black globe had disappeared, bolting faster and faster toward its rendezvous with hyperspace. The director turned to the emissary from Earth. "It is gone. Now we wait. 1 Earth-style month. I will state one more time that I did not approve willingly of the inclusion of the organic form aboard the ship. I object to the inelegant modifications required in order to suit the ship to biological functions. Also, old-style humans are 3 times as often subject to irrational impulses than more modern forms. This one may take it into its head to try to change the ship's controls when the fatal stress begins." Unlike the director, the visiting counselor wore a humaniform body, with legs, arms, torso, and head. He expressed his opinion with a shrug of his subtly articulated shoulders. "You exaggerate the danger, Director. Don't you think I know that the controls Jason Forbes sees in front of him are only dummies?" The director swiveled quickly to stare at the counselor. "How?" He made himself calm down. "It doesn't matter." So what if he knew that fact? Even the sole ethicalist member of the Solar System Council could not make much propaganda of it. It was only a logical precaution to take, under the circumstances. "The designated oral witness engineer should spend his living moments performing his function," the director said coolly, "recording his subjective impressions as long as he is able. It is the role you commanded we open up for an old-style human, using your peremptory authority as a member of the council." The other's humaniform face flexed in a traditional pseudo-organic smile, archaic in its mimicry of the old race. And yet the director, schooled in utilitarian belief, felt uneasy under the counselor's gaze. I had a peremptory commandment left to use up before the elections, the counselor said smoothly in old-fashioned, modulated tones. I judged that this would be an appropriate way to use it. He did not explain further. The director quashed an urge to push the question. What was the ethicalist up to? Why waste a peremptory command on such a minor, futile thing as this? How could he gain anything by sending an old-style human out to his certain death? Was it to be some sort of gesture? Something aimed at getting out the biological vote for the upcoming elections? If so, it was doomed to failure. In-depth psychological studies had indicated that the level of resignation and apathy among organic citizens was too high to ever be overcome by anything so simple. Perhaps, though, it might be enough to save the seat of the one ethicalist on the council. The director felt warm. He knew that it was partly subjective. Resentment of this invasion of his domain by a ridiculous sentimentalist. Most of all, the director resented the feelings he felt boiling within himself. Why do we modern forms have to be cursed with this sudden burden of emotionalism and uncertainty? I hate it. Of course he knew the reasons. Back in ancient times, fictional robots had been depicted as caricatures of jerky motion and rigid, formal thinking. The writers of those pre-cryo days had not realized that complexity commanded flexibility, even fallibility. The laws of physics were adamant on this. Uncertainty accompanied subtlety. An advanced mind had to have the ability to question itself, or creativity was lost. The director loathed the fact, but he understood it. Still, he suspected that the biologists had played a trick on his kind long ago. He and other utilitarians had an idea that there had been some deep programming below anything nowadays accessed to make mechano-people as much like the old style as possible. If I ever had proof it was true, he thought, gloweringly, threateningly. But it doesn't matter. The biologicals will be extinct in a few generations anyway. They're dying of a sense of their own uselessness. Good riddance. I will leave you now, counselor, unless you wish to accompany me to recharge on refrigerants. The ethicalist bowed slightly, ironically, aware, of course, that the director could not return the gesture. No, thank you, director. I shall wait here and contemplate for a while. Before you go, however, please let me make one thing clear. It may seem at times as if I'm not sympathetic with your work here, but that is not true. After all, we're all humans, all citizens. Everybody wants Project Light Probe to succeed. The dream is one we inherit from our makers, to go out and live among the stars. I am only acting to help bring that about for all of our people. The director felt unaccountably warmer. He could not think of an answer. I require helium, he said curtly, and swiveled to leave. Goodbye, counselor. The director felt as if eyes were watching his armored back as he sped down the hallway. Damn the biologicals and their allies, he cursed within. Damn them for making us so insidiously like them, emotional, fallible, and, worst of all, uncertain. Wishing the last of the old style were already dust on their dirty, wet little planet, The director hurried away to find himself a long, cold drink. 5. 6 hours and 10 minutes into the mission. 4 minutes since breakover into hyperspace. Jason breathed into the microphone. So far, so good. I'm a little thirsty, but I believe it's just a typical adrenaline fear reaction. Allowing for expected tension, I feel fine. Jason went on to describe everything he could see. The lights, the controls, the readings on the computer displays, his physical feelings. He went on until his throat felt dry and he found he was repeating himself. I'm getting up out of the observer's seat now to go get a drink. He slipped the recorder strap over his shoulder and unbuckled from the flight chair. There was a feeling of weight, as the techs had told him to expect. About 1/10 of a G. It was enough to make walking possible. He flexed his legs and moved about the control room, describing every aspect of the experience. Then he went to the refrigerator and took out a squeeze tube of lemonade. Jason was frankly surprised to be alive. He knew the previous Voyagers had lived several days before their unknown catastrophe struck, but they'd been a lot tougher than he. Perhaps the mysterious lethal agency had taken nearly all the 15 days of the minimum first leg of the round trip to do them in. If so, he wondered, how long will it take to get me? A few hours later, the failure of anything to happen was starting to make him nervous. He cut down the rate of his running commentary in order to save his voice. Besides, nothing much seemed to be changing. The ship was cruising now. All the dials and indicators were green and steady. During sleep period, he tossed in the sleeping hammock, sharing it with disturbed dreams. He awakened several times, impelled by a sense of duty and imminent danger, clutching his recorder tightly. But when he stared about the control room, he could find nothing amiss. By the third day, he had had enough. I'm going to poke around in the instruments, he spoke into the microphone. I know I was told not to, and I'll certainly not touch anything having to do with the functioning of the ship, but I figure I deserve a chance to see what I'm traveling through. Nobody's ever looked out on hyperspace. I'm going to take a look. Jason set about the task with a feeling of exultation. What he was doing wouldn't hurt anything, just alter a few of the sensors. Sure, it was against orders, but if he got back alive, he would be famous. Too important to bother with charges over such a minor infraction. Not that he believed, for even a moment, that he was coming home alive. It was a fairly intricate task, rearranging a few of the ship's programs so the external cameras, meant to be used at the destination star only, would work in hyperspace. He wondered if it had been some sort of utilitarian gesture not to include viewing ports, or to do the small modifications of scanning electronics necessary to make the cameras work here. There was no obvious scientific reason to look at hyperspace, so perhaps the utilitarian technicians rejected it as an atavistic desire. Jason finished all but the last adjustments, then took a break to fix himself a meal before turning on the cameras. While he ate, he made another recorder entry. There was little to report. A little trouble with the cryogen cooling units. They were laboring a bit, but the efficiency loss didn't seem to be anything critical. Yet. After dinner, he sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the screen he had commandeered. Well now, let's see what this famous hyperspace looks like, he said. At least the folks back home will know that it was an old-style man who first looked out on... The screen rippled. Then suddenly came a light. Light! Jason had to shield his eyes. Hyperspace was ablaze with light. His thoughts whirled. Could this have something to do with the threat? The unknown malign force that had killed all the previous crews? Jason cracked an eyelid and lowered his arm slightly. The screen was bright, but now that his eyes had adapted, it wasn't painful to look at. He gazed in fascination on a scene of whirling pink and white, as if the ship was hurtling through an endless sky of bright pastel clouds. It looked rather pleasant, in fact. This is a threat? He wondered, dazedly. How could this soft brilliance kill? Jason's jaw opened as a relay seemed to close in his mind. He stared at the screen for a long moment, wondering if his growing suspicion could be true. He laughed out loud, a hard, ironic laugh, as yet more tense than hopeful. He set to work finding out if his suspicion was right, after all. 6. The lightship cruised on autopilot until at last it came to rest not far from its launching point. Little tugs approached gently and grappled with the black globe, pulling it toward the derricks, where the inspection crew waited to swarm aboard. In the station control center, technicians monitored the activity outside. "I am proceeding with routine hailing call," the communications technician announced, sending a metal tentacle toward the transmit switch. "Why bother?" another mechano-cryo tech asked. "There certainly isn't anyone aboard that death ship to hear it." The comm officer did not bother answering. He pressed the send switch. "This is Light Probe Central to Light Probe 9. Do you read Light Probe 9? The other tech turned away in disgust. He had already suspected the comm officer of being a closet ethicalist. Imagine wasting energy trying to talk to a month-dead organic corpse. "Light Probe 9, come in. This is..." "Light Probe 9 to Light Probe Central. This is Oral Witness Engineer Jason Forbes, ready to relinquish command to inspection crew." The control room was suddenly silent. All the techs stared at the wall speaker. The comm officer hovered, too stunned to reply. "Would you let my wife know I'm all right?" the voice continued. "And please have station services bring over something cool to drink." The tableau held for another long moment. At last, the comm officer moved to reply, an undisciplined tone of excitement betrayed in his voice. "Right away, Witness Engineer Forbes, and welcome home." At the back of the control room, a tech wearing a globe-form body hurried off to tell the director. 7. A crowd of metal, ceramic, and cyborg flesh surrounded a single pale, old-style human, floating stripped to his shorts, sipping a frosted squeeze tube of amber liquid. "Actually, it's not too unpleasant a place," he told those gathered around in the conference room, "but it's a good thing I violated orders and looked outside when I did. I was able to turn off all unnecessary power and lighting in time to slow the heat buildup. As it was, it got pretty hot toward the end of the 15 days. The director was still obviously in a state of shock. The globular form bureaucrat had lapsed from utilitarian dialect and spoke in the quasi-human tones he had grown up with. But the ship's interior should not have heated up so. The vessel was equipped with the best and most durable refrigerators and radiators we could make. Similar models have operated in the solar system and on slowboat starships for hundreds of years." Jason nodded. He sipped from his tube of iced lemonade and grinned. "Oh, yeah. The refrigerators and radiators worked just fine, just like the cooling plant." He gestured out the window, where the huge radiator globe could be seen drifting slowly across the sky. "But there was one problem. Just like the cooling plant, the shipboard refrigeration system was designed to work in normal space." He gestured at the blackness outside, punctuated here and there by pinpoint stars. Out there, the ambient temperature is less than 3 degrees, absolute. Point your radiators into intergalactic space and virtually no radiation hits them from the sky. Even the small amount of heat in supercooled helium can escape. One doesn't need compressors and all that complicated gear they had to use in order to make cryogens on Earth. You hardly have to do more than point shielded pipes out of the blackness and send the stuff through them. You mechanical types get the cheap cryogens you need. But in hyperspace, it's different. I didn't have the right instruments, so I couldn't give you a precise figure, but I'd guess the ambient temperature on that plane is above the melting point of water ice. Of course, in an environment like that, the ship's radiators were horribly inefficient. Barely good enough to get rid of the heat from the cabin and engines, and certainly not efficient enough in their present design to cool cryogens. The director stared, unwilling to believe what he was hearing. One of the senior scientists rolled forward. Then the previous crews all went mad or died when the cryohelium evaporated. Their superconducting brains overheated. It's the one mode of mortality that is hard to detect because it's gradual. The first effect is a deterioration of mental function, followed by insanity and violence. No wonder the previous crews came back all torn up. And autopsies showed nothing since everything heats up after death anyway. Another tech sighed. Hyperspace seems so harmless. The theory in the first automated probes, we looked for complicated dangers. We never thought to take its temperature, Jason suggested wryly. But why look so glum? He grinned. You all should be delighted. We found out the problem, and it turns out to be nothing at all. The director spun on him. Nothing, you insipid biological. Can't you see this is disaster? We counted on hyperspace to open the stars for us, but it is infernally expensive to use unless we keep the ships small. And how can we keep them small if we must build huge, intricate cooling systems that must look out into that boiling hell you found? With the trickle of cryogens we'll be able to maintain during those weeks in hyperspace, it will be nearly impossible to maintain life aboard. You say our problems are solved? The director spoke acidly. But you miss one point, witness engineer Forbes. How will we ever find crews to man those ships? The director hummed with barely suppressed anger, his eye cells glowing. Jason rubbed his chin and pursed his lips sympathetically. Well, I don't know, but I bet with a few minor improvements something could be arranged. Why don't you try recruiting crews from another boiling hell, one where water ice is already melted? There was a silence for a moment. Then from the back of the room came laughter. A mechano with a seal of office hanging from his humaniform neck clapped its hands together and grinned. Oh, wait till they hear of this on Earth. Now we'll see how the voting goes. He grinned at Jason and laughed in rich human tones. When the biologists find out about this, they'll rise up like the very tide, and so will every closet ethicalist in the system. Jason smiled, but right now his mind was far from politics. All he knew was that his wife and son would not live in shame. His boy would be a starship rider and inherit the galaxy. You won't have any trouble recruiting crews, sir, he told the director. I'm ready to go back any time. Hyperspace isn't all that bad a place. Would you care to come along? Super cold steam vented from the director's carapace, a loud hiss of indignation. The utilitarian bureaucrat ground out something too low for Jason to overhear. even though he leaned forward politely. The laughter from the back of the room rose in peals of hilarity. Jason sipped his lemonade and waited. Bubbles. 1. On planets, they say, water always runs downhill. Serena had no way of knowing if it was true. She had never been on a planet, not in the brief million or so years she had been aware. Neither had any of her acquaintances. The very idea was ridiculous. Very few grand voyagers ever got to see a planet, and yet even among them the ancient truisms were still told. That which goes up must fall, and will. The clichés came out of a foggy past. Why should she question them? Why should she care? No matter how far down you fall, you can always go lower still. Stunned and still nearly senseless from her passage through the maelstrom, Serena numbly contemplated truths inherited down the aeons from distant times when her ancestors actually dwelled on tiny slivers of rock down close to the bright flames of burning stars. She had had no inkling when she had tunneled away from the spiral galaxy 998612A with a full cargo that the ancient sayings would soon apply to her. Or do they? She wondered. Was she perhaps as far down as one could possibly get? It seemed to Serena right then that there just wasn't any lower to go. Her systems creaked and groaned as her instruments readapted to normal space-time. Serena still felt the heat of her passage through Kaluza space. That incandescent journey through the bowels of the singularity had raised her temperature dangerously near the fatal point. Now, though, she realized that her radiators were spilling that excess heat into a coldness like none she had ever known before. Blackness stretched in all directions around her. Impossible. My sensors must be damaged, she hoped. But the repair drones reported nothing wrong with their instruments. The real harm had been done elsewhere. Then why can I not see stars? She increased the sensitivity of her opticals, increased it again, and at last began to see a pattern, a spray of tiny motes of light spread across the black vault. Tiny, tiny, faraway spirals and fuzzy globes. Galaxies. Had she been an organism, Serena might have blinked, have closed her eyes against dismay. Only galaxies? Serena had traveled deep space all her life. It was her mission, carrying commerce between far-flung islands of intelligence. She was used to black emptiness, but not like this. Galaxies, she thought. No stars, only galaxies, everywhere. She knew galaxies, of course, island universes containing gas clouds and dust and vast myriads of stars, from millions to trillions each. Her job, after all, was to haul gifts from one spiral swirl to the next, or to and from great elliptical giants, galaxies so huge that it seemed extravagant of the universe to have made more than one. She had spent 1,000,000 years carrying cargo from one galaxy to another, and yet had never been outside of one before. Outside? She quailed from the thought, staring at the multitude of foggy specks all around her. But there isn't anything outside of galaxies. Oh, she had always used distant ones for navigation as stable points of reference, but always they had been drowned out in a swarm of nearby stars. Always there had been one great galactic disk, vast because it lay all around her, a bright, restless, noisy place filled with traffic and bustling civilizations. She had always felt sorry for the members of those hot little cultures, so busy, so quick. They flashed through their tiny lives so briefly. They never got to see the great expanses, the vistas that she traveled. Their kind had made her kind long ago, but that was so far in the past now that few planet dwellers any longer knew where the grand voyagers had come from. They simply took Serena and her cousins for granted. Now, she had never been outside before, for traveling among the galaxies had never meant traveling between them. Her job was to ply the deep ways at the hearts of those galactic swirls where stars were packed so dense and tight that their light hardly had room to escape, where they whirled and danced quick pavans and occasionally collided in brilliant fury. Sometimes the crowded stars combined. In the core of nearly every galaxy there lay at least one great black hole, a gravitational well so deep that space itself warped and curled in tight geometries of compression. And these singularities offered paths from one galaxy to another. The great nebulae were not linked at their edges, but at their hearts. So how did I get here? Serena wondered. Here, so far from any galaxy at all. Part of the answer, she knew, lay in her cargo bay. Pallet 14 was a twisted ruin. Some violent event there had bruised her Kaluza fields, just at the most critical phase of diving into a singularity when she had to tunnel from one loop of space-time to another. In disgust, she used several of her remote drones to pry apart the tortured container. The drones played light over a multicolored, spiny mass. Needle-like projections splayed in all directions, like rays of light frozen in mid-spray. The thing was quite beautiful, and it had certainly killed her. Idiots, she cursed. Nobody had informed her that antimatter was part of her cargo. In Kaluza space, normal means for containing it were inadequate. She had thought even the most simple-minded quick-life cultures would know to take precautions. She tried to think, to remember. In that last galaxy, there had been funny little creatures who twittered at her in languages so obscure that even her sophisticated linguistic programs could barely follow them. The beings had used no machines, she recalled, but instead flitted about their star-filled galactic core on the backs of great winged beast-craft made of protoplasm. A few of the living ships were so large that Serena had been able to see them unmagnified as specks fluttering near her great bulk. It was the first time she recalled ever seeing life up close without artificial aid. Perhaps the creatures had not understood that machine intelligences, like Serena, had special needs. Perhaps they thought... Serena had no idea what they thought. All she knew was that their cargo had exploded just as she was midway down the narrow way between that galaxy and another, diving and swooping along paths of twisted space. To lose power in a singularity. Serena wondered. It had happened to none of the Voyagers she ever encountered, but sometimes Voyagers disappeared. Perhaps this was what happened to the ones who vanished. Galaxies. Her attention kept drifting across the vault surrounding her. The brush strokes of light lay scattered almost evenly across the sky. It was unnerving to see so many galaxies and no stars. No stars at all. Plenty of stars, she corrected herself, but all of them smeared in their billions into those islands in the sky. None of the galaxies appeared to be appreciably above average in size, or appreciably closer than any other. By this time her radiators had cooled far below the danger level. How could they not? It was as cold here as it ever could get. Enough light struck her to keep the temperature just near 3 degrees absolute. Some of that faint light came from the galaxies. The rest was long-wave radiation from space itself. It was smooth, isotropic, the slowly ebbing roar of the long-ago birth of everything. Her remote drones reported in. Repairs had progressed. She could move if she chose. Great, she thought. Move where? She experimented. Her drives thrummed. She felt action and reaction as pure laser light thrust from her tail. Her accelerometers swung. That was it. There was no other way she could tell she was moving at all. There were no reference points whose relationships would slowly shift as she swept past. The galaxies were too far away, much, much too far away. She tried to think of an adjective, some term from any of the many languages she knew to convey just how far away they were. The truth of her situation was just sinking in. Serena knew that a planet-bound creature, such as her distant ancestors, would have looked at her in amazement. She was herself nearly as large as some small planets. If one of those world-evolved creatures were to find itself on her surface, equipped with the requirements to survive, it might move in its accustomed way. It had been called walking, she remembered, and spend its entire brief lifespan before traveling her length. She tried to imagine how such creatures must have looked upon the spaces between their rocky little worlds back in their early days. It was a million-fold increase in scale from the size of a planet to that of a solar system. The prospect must have been daunting. Then, after they had laboriously conquered their home planetary system, how they must have quailed before the interstellar distances, yet another million times as great. To Serena, they were routine, but how stunning those spaces must have seemed to her makers. How totally frustrating and unfathomable. Now she understood how they must have felt. Serena increased power to her drives. She clung to the feeling of acceleration, spitting light behind her, driving faster and faster. Her engines roared. For a time she lost herself in the passion of it, thrusting with all her might toward a speck of light chosen at random. She spent energy like a wastrel, pouring it out in a frantic need to move. Agoraphobia was a terrible discovery to a grand voyager. She howled at the black emptiness, at the distant, tantalizing pools of light. She blasted forth with the heat of her panic. Galaxies. Any galaxy would do, any one at all. Blind to all but terror, she shot through space like a bolt of light, but light was far too slow. Sense took hold at last, or perhaps some deep-hidden wisdom circuit she had not even known of, triggered in a futile reflex for self-preservation. Her drives shut down, and Serena found herself coasting. For a time, she simply folded inward, closing off from the universe, huddling within a corner of her mind darker even than the surrounding night. 2. Galaxies have their ages, their phases, just as living things do. Aim your telescope toward the farthest specks, motes so distant that their light is reddened with the stretching of the universe. The universal expansion makes their flight seem rapid. It also means that the light you see is very, very old. These, then, are the youngest things you will ever see. Quasars and galaxies at the very earliest stages, when the black holes in their cores were hot, still gobbling stars by the hundreds, blaring forth great bursts of light and belching searing beams of accelerated particles. Look closer. The galaxies you'll see will be flying away from you less quickly. Their light will be less reddened, and they will be older. Pinwheel spirals turn, looking like fried eggs made of 100 billion sparks. In their centers, the black holes are now calmer. All the easy prey have been consumed, and now only a few stars fall into their maws from time to time. The raging has diminished enough to let life grow in the slowly rotating hinterlands. Spiral arms show where clots of gas and giant molecular clouds concentrate in shock waves like spume and spindrift gathering on a windswept verge. Here, new stars are born. The largest of these sweep through their short lives and explode, filling nearby space with heavy elements, fertilizing the fields of life. Barred spirals, irregulars, ellipticals. There are other styles of galaxies as well, sprayed like dandelion seeds across the firmament. But not randomly. No, not randomly at all. 3. Slowly, Serena came back to her senses. She felt a distant amusement. Dandelion seeds? Somehow her similes had taken on a style so archaic, perhaps it was a form of defensive reaction. Her memory banks drew forth an image of puffballs bending before a gusty wind, then scattering sparkling specks forth. Fair enough, she thought of the comparison. All sense of motion was lost, although she knew she had undergone immense acceleration. The galaxies lay all around her, apparently unchanged. She looked again on the universe, peered at one quadrant of the sky, then another. Perhaps they aren't scattered as smoothly as I'd thought. She contemplated for some time, then decided. Fortunately, her cargo wasn't anybody's property, per se. Gifts. That was what the Grand Voyagers, like her, carried. No civilization could think of trade between galaxies. Even using the singularities, there was no way to send anything in expectation of payment. No. The hot, quick, short-lived cultures took whatever Grand Voyagers like Serena brought and loaded them down with presents to take to the next stop. Nobody ever told a Voyager where to go. Serena and her cousins traveled wherever whim took them. So she wasn't really stealing when she started dismantling her cargo section, pulling forth whatever she found and adapting the treasures for her own purposes. The observatory took only 50 years to build. 4. Strings. Bubbles. The galaxies were not evenly distributed through expanding space. The universe was full of holes. In fact, most of it was emptiness. Light shimmered at the edges of yawning cavities like flickers on the surface of a soap bubble. The galaxies and clusters of galaxies lay strung at the fringes of monstrous cavities. While she performed her careful survey, cataloging and measuring every mote her instruments could find, Serena also sought through her records, through the ancient archives carried by every Grand Voyager. She found that she had not been the first to discover this. The galaxies were linked with one another via Kaluza space through the black holes at their centers. A Grand Voyager traveled those ways and so never got far enough outside the great spirals to see them in this perspective. Now, though, Serena thought she understood. There wasn't just one big bang at the beginning of time, she realized. It was more complicated than that. The original kernel had divided early on and then divided again and again. The universe had many centers of expansion, and it was at the intersecting shock waves of those explosions that matter had condensed, roiled, and formed into galaxies and stars. So I am at the bottom, she realized. Somehow, when the explosion sent her tumbling in Kaluza's space, she had slipped off the rails. She had fallen nearly all the way to the center of one of the great explosions. One could fall no farther. The calculations were clear on something else as well. Even should she accelerate with everything she had and get so close to light speed that relativistic time foreshortened, she would still never make it even to the nearest galaxy. Such emptiness, she contemplated. Why, even the cosmic rays were faint here, and those sleeting nuclei were only passing through. It was rare for Serena to detect even an atom of hydrogen as a neighbor. It is better, far, to light a candle than to curse the darkness. For a time it was only the soft melancholy of ancient poetry that saved Serena from the one-way solace of despair. 5. To the very center, then. Why not? Serena wondered. According to her calculations, she was much, much closer to the center of the great bubble than to any of the sprayed galaxies at its distant rim. Indeed, why not? It would be something to do. She found she only had to modify her velocity a little. She had already been heading roughly that way by accident from that first panicked outburst. She passed the time reading works from 1,000,000 poets, from 1,000,000 noble races. She created sub-personae, little separate personalities, which could argue with each other, discussing the relative merits of so many planet-bound points of view. It helped to pass the time. Soon, after only a few thousand years, it was time to decelerate, or she would simply streak past the center, with no time even to contemplate the bottom, the navel of creation. Serena used much of her reserve, killing the last of her velocity, relative to the bubble of galaxies. All around her, the red shifts were the same, constant. All the galaxies seemed to recede away at the same rate. So, here I am. She coasted and realized that she had just completed the last task of any relevance she could ever aspire to. There were no more options, no other deeds that could be done. Hello? Irritably, Serena wiped her conversation banks, clearing away the sub-personae that had helped her while away the last few centuries. She did not want those little artificial voices disturbing her as she contemplated the manner of bringing about her own end. I wonder how big a flash I'll make, she thought. Is it even remotely possible that anyone back in the inhabited universe might see it, even if they were looking this way with the best instruments? She caressed the fields in her engines, and she knew she had the will to do what must be done. Hello? Has somebody come? Serena sent angry surges through her lingula systems. Stop it. Suicide would come none too soon. I must be going crazy. She sub-vocalized, and some of her agony slipped out into space around her. Yes. Many feel that way when they arrive here. Quakes of surprise made Serena tremble. The voice had come from outside. Who are you? She gasped. I am the one who waits, the one who collects and greets, the voice replied, and then, after some hesitation, I am the coward. 6. Joy sparkled and burst from Serena. She shouted, though the only one in the universe to hear her was near enough to touch. She cried aloud, "There is a way!" The coward was larger than Serena. He drifted nearby, looking like nothing so much as a great assemblage of junk from every and any civilization imaginable. He had already explained that the bits and pieces had been contributed by countless stranded entities before her. By now he was approaching the mass of a small star and had to hold the pieces apart with webs of frozen field lines. The coward seemed disturbed by Serena's enthusiasm. "But I've already explained to you it isn't a way. It is death." Serena could not make clear to the thing that she had already been ready to die. "That remains to be seen. All I know is that you have told me there is a way out of this place, and that many have arrived here before me and taken that route away from here." "I tell you it is a funnel into hell." "So a black hole seems to planet dwellers, but we grand voyagers dive into them and traverse the tortured lanes of Kaluza space. And I have told you that this is not a black hole, and what lies within this opening is not Kaluza space, but a door into madness and destruction." Serena found that she pitied the poor thing. She could not imagine choosing, as it obviously had, to sit here at the center of nothingness for all eternity, an eternity broken every few million years by the arrival of one more stranded voyager. Apparently, every one of Serena's predecessors had ignored the poor thing's advice, giving him what they had to spare, and then eagerly taken that escape offered, no matter how hazardous. "Show it to me, please," she asked politely. The coward sighed and turned to lead the way. 7. It has long been hypothesized that there was more than one episode of creation. The discovery that the universe of galaxies is distributed like soap bubbles, each expanding from its own center, was the great confirmation that the Big Bang, at least, had not been undivided. But the ideas went beyond that. What if? They had wondered, even in ancient days. What if there are other universes altogether? She and Coward traded data files while they moved leisurely toward the hole at the very center of all. Serena was in no hurry now that she had a destination again. She savored the vast store of knowledge Coward had accumulated. Her own grand voyagers were not the first, it seemed, to have cruised the great wormholes between the galaxies. There were others, some greater, who had nevertheless found themselves, for whatever reason, shipwrecked here at the base of everything. And all of them, no doubt, had contemplated the dizzying emptiness that lay before them now. A steady stream of very strange particles emanated from a twisted shapelessness. Rarities, such as magnetic monopoles, swept past Serena more thickly than she ever would have imagined possible. Here they were more common than atoms. "As I said, it leads to another place, a place where the fundamentals of our universe do not hold. We can tell very little from this side, only that charge, mass, gravity, all have different meanings there. Tell me, then, what hope does a creature of our universe have of surviving there? Will your circuits conduct? Will your junctions quantum jump properly? Will your laser drives even function if electrons aren't allowed to occupy the same energy state? For a moment, the coward's fear infected Serena. The closer she approached, the more eerie and dangerous this undertaking seemed. And nobody has ever come back out again, the coward whispered. Serena shook herself out of her funk. Her situation remained the same. If this was nothing more than yet another way to suicide, at least it had the advantage of being interesting. And who knows? Many of my predecessors were wiser than I, and they all chose this path as well. I thank you for your friendship, she told the coward. I give you all of this spare mass for my cargo as a token of affection. Resignedly, the coward sent drone ships to pick up the baggage Serena shed. They cruised away into the blackness. What you see is only a small fraction of what I have accumulated, he explained. How much? He gave her a number, and for a long moment there was only silence between them. Then the coward went on. And lately, you castaways have been growing more and more common. I have hope that soon someone shall arrive who will leave me more than fragments. Serena pulsed to widen the gap between them. She began to feel a soft tug, something wholly unlike gravity or any other force she had ever known. I wish you well, she said. The coward, too, began to back away. The other's voice was chastened, somber. So many others seem to find me pitiable because I wait here, because I am not adventuresome. I do believe you will find your own destiny, she told him. She dared not say what she really thought, so she kept her words vague. You will find greatness that surpasses that of even those much more bold in spirit, she predicted. Then, before the stunned ancient thing could reply, she turned and accelerated toward her destiny. 8. On planets, they say, water always runs downhill. From the bottom, from as low as one could go in all the universe, Serena plunged downward into another place. Her shields thickened and her drives flexed. As ready as she would ever be, she dived into the strangeness ahead. She thought about the irony of it all. He calls himself coward, she contemplated, and knew that it was unfair. She and all of those who had plunged this way, blindly into the unknowable, were the real cowards in a way. Oh, she could only speak for herself, but she guessed that their greatest motive was fear. Fear of the long loneliness, the empty aeons without anything to do. And all the while, coward accumulated mass, bits of space junk, debris cast out from Kaluza space, cargo jettisoned or donated by castaways who, like her, were only passing through. He had told Serena how much mass, and then he had told her that the rate of accumulation was slowly growing over the long epochs. And with the mass, he accumulates knowledge. For Serena had opened her libraries to him and found them absorbed more quickly than she would have ever thought possible. The same thing must have happened countless times before. Already space had warped beyond recognition around her. Serena looked back and out at all the galaxies, distant motes of light now smeared into swirls of lambent glow. Astronomers of every civilization puzzle over the question of the missing mass, Serena thought. Calculations showed that there had to be more mass than could be counted by measuring the galaxies and what could be detected of the gases in between. Even cosmic rays and neutrinos could not account for it. Half of the matter was simply missing. Coward had told her. He was accumulating it, here and there. Dark patches, clots, stuffed in field-stabilized clusters, scattered around the vast emptiness of the center of the great galactic bubble. Perhaps I should have stayed and talked with him some more, Serena thought as she smeared light melded into a golden glory. She might have told him. She might have said it. But with all of his brain power, no doubt he had figured it out long ago and chose to hide the knowledge away from himself. All that mass. Someday the galaxies would die. No new stars would be born. The glow would fade. Life, even life crafted out of baryonic machines, would glimmer and go out. But the recession of the dead whirlpools would slow. It would stop, reverse, and fall again toward the great gravitational pull at the center of each bubble, and their universes would be born anew. Serena saw the last glimmer of galactic light twinkle and disappear. She knew the real reason why she had chosen to take this gamble, to dive into this tunnel to an alien realm. It was one thing to flee loneliness. It was quite another thing to flee one who would be God. No wonder all the others had made the same choice. The walls of the tunnel converged. She plunged ahead. All around her was strangeness. Ambiguity. 1. Back when he was still a student, Stan Goldman and his friends used to play a game of make-believe. How long do you think it would take Isaac Newton to solve this homework set? They would ask each other. Or, if Einstein were alive today, do you think he'd bother with graduate school? It was the same sort of lazy, get-nowhere argument he also heard his musician friends debate on occasion. What do you figure Mozart would make of our stuff? They'd pose over bottles of beer. If we snatched him from his own time to the 1990s, would he freak out and call it damn noise? Or would he catch on, wear mirror shades, and cut an album right away? At that point, Stan used to cut in. Which Mozart do you mean? The arriviste social climber? The craftsman of the biographies? Or the brash rebel of Amadeus? The composers and players seemed puzzled by his non sequitur. Why, the real one, of course. Their reply convinced him that for all their closeness, for all their well-known affinity, physicists and musicians would never fully understand each other. Oh, I see. The real one. Of course. But what is reality? Through a thick portal of fused quartz, mediated by a series of 300 field-reinforced half-mirrors, Stan now watched the essence of nothingness. Suspended in a sealed vacuum, a potential singularity spun and danced in non-existence. In other words, the chamber was empty. Soon, though, potentiality would turn into reality. The virtual would become actual. Twisted space would spill light and tortured vacuum would briefly give forth matter. The utterly improbable would happen. Or at least that was the general idea. Stan watched and waited, patiently. Until the end of his life, Albert Einstein struggled against the implications of quantum mechanics. He had helped invent the new physics. It bore his imprint as fully as Dirac's or Heisenberg's or Bohr's. And yet, like Max Planck, he had always felt uncomfortable with its implications, insisting that the Copenhagen rules of probabilistic nature must be mere crude approximations of the real patterns governing the world. Beneath the dreadful quantum ambiguity, he felt there must be the signature of a designer. Only the design eluded Einstein. Its elegant precision fled before experimentalists who prodded first atoms, then nuclei, and at last the so-called fundamental particles. Always, the deeper they probed, the fuzzier grew the mesh of creation. In fact, to a later generation of physicists, ambiguity was no enemy. Rather, it became a tool. It was the law. Stan grew up picturing nature as a whimsical goddess. She seemed to say, "Look at me from afar, and you may pretend that there are firm rules, that here is cause and there effect. But remember, if you need this solace, stay back and squint. If, on the other hand, you dare approach, should you examine my garments weft and warp, well, then don't say I didn't warn you." With this machine, Stan Goldman expected to be looking closer than anyone ever had before, and he did not expect much security. "You ready down there, Stan?" Alex Lustig's voice carried down the companionway. He and the others were in the control center, but Stan had volunteered to keep watch here by the peephole. It was a vital job, but one requiring none of the quickness of the younger physicists. In other words, just right for an old codger like himself. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Alex," he called back. "Good. Your timer should start running now." True to Alex's word, the display to Stan's left began counting down whirling milliseconds. After the end of the Gaia War, when things had calmed down enough to allow a resumption of basic science, their efforts had soon returned to studying the basic nature of singularities. Now, in this lab far beyond the orbit of Mars, they had received permission to embark on the boldest experiment yet. Stan wiped his palms on his dungarees and wondered why he felt so nervous. After all, he had participated in the manufacture of bizarre objects before. In his youth, at CERN, it had been a zoo of subatomic particles, wrought out of searing heat at the target end of a great accelerator. Even in those days, the names physicists gave the particles they studied told you more about their own personalities than the things they pursued. He recalled graffiti on the wall of the men's room in Geneva. "Question: what do you get when you mix a charmed red quark with a strange one that's green and a third that's true blue?" Underneath were scrawled answers, in various hands and as many languages. "I don't know, but to hold them together you'll need a glue-on with attitude. Sounds like what they served in the cafeteria today. Speaking of which, anyone here know the flavor of beauty? Doesn't it depend on who's on top and who's on the bottom? I'm getting a hard-on just thinking about it. Hey, what boson thought of this question anyway? Yeah, there's a guy who ought to be leapt on." Stan smiled, remembering good times. They had been hunters in those days, he and the others, chasing and capturing specimens of elusive microscopic species, expanding the quarky bestiary till a theory of everything began to emerge. Gravitons and gravitinos, magnetic monopoles and photinos. With unification came the power to mix and match and use nature's ambiguity. Still, he never dreamed he might someday play with singularities, micro black holes, using them as circuit elements, the same blithe way an engineer might string together inductors and resistors. But young fellows like Alex seemed to take it all in stride. 3 minutes, Stan. I can read a clock, he shouted back, trying to sound more irritated than he really was. In truth, he really had lost track of the time. His mind now seemed to move at a tangent to that flow, nearly but not quite parallel to the event cone of the objective world. We're told subjectivity, that old enemy of science, becomes its ally at the level of the quantum. Some say it's only the presence of an observer that causes the probability wave to collapse. It's the observer who ultimately notes the plummet of an electron from its shell, as well as the sparrow in a forest. Without observers, not only is a falling tree without sound, it's a concept without meaning. Of late, Stan had been wondering ever more about that. Nature, even down to the lowliest quark, seemed to be performing as if for an audience. Arguments raged between adherents of the strong and weak anthropic principles over whether observers were required by the universe or merely convenient to it. But everyone now agreed that having an audience mattered. So much, then, for the debate over what Newton would say if he were snatched out of his time and brought to the present. His clockwork world was as alien to Stan's as that of a tribal shaman. In fact, in some ways, the shaman actually had it, hands down, over prissy old Isaac. At least, Stan imagined, the shaman would probably make better company at a party. 1 minute, keep your eye on... Alex's voice cut off suddenly as automatic timers sent the crash doors hissing shut. Stan shook himself, hauling his mind back and making an earnest effort to concentrate. It would have been different were there something for him to do, but everything was sequenced, even data collection. Later they would pore over it all and argue. For now, though, he had only to watch, to observe. Before man, he wondered, who performed this role for the universe? There appears to be no rule that the observer has to be conscious, so animals might have served without being self-aware, and on other worlds creatures might have existed long before life filled Earth's seas. It isn't necessary that every event, every rockfall, every quantum of light be appreciated, only that some of it, somewhere, come to the attention of someone who notices and cares. But then, Stan debated himself aloud, who noticed or cared at the beginning, before the planets, before stars? Who was there in the pre-creation nothing to watch the vacuum fluctuation of all time, the one that turned into the Big Bang? In his thoughts, Stan answered his own question. If the universe needs at least one observer in order to exist, then that's the one compelling argument for the necessity of God. The counter reached 0. Beneath it, the panel of fused quartz remained black. Nevertheless, Stan knew something was happening. Deep in the bowels of the chamber, the energy state of raw vacuum was being forced to change. Uncertainty. That was the lever. Take a cubical box of space, say a centimeter on a side. Does it contain a proton? If so, there's a limit to how much you can know about that proton with any sureness. You cannot know its momentum more precisely than a given value without destroying your chance of knowing where it is. If you find a way to zoom in on the box until the proton's location is incredibly exact, then your knowledge of its speed and direction plummets toward 0. Another linked pair of values is energy and time. You may think you know how much or little energy the box contains. In a vacuum, it tends toward baseline zero. But what about fluctuations? What if bits of matter and antimatter suddenly appear, only to abruptly disappear again? Then the average would still be the same, and all account books would stay balanced. Within this chamber, modern trickery was using that very loophole to pry away at nature's wall. Stan glanced at the mass gauge. It sped upscale, rapidly. Femtograms, picograms, nanograms of matter coalesced in a space too small to measure. Micrograms, milligrams, each newly born hadron pair shimmered for a moment too narrow to notice. Particle and antiparticle tried to flee, tried to annihilate, but before they could cancel out again, each was drawn into a trap of folded space, sucked down a narrow funnel of gravity smaller than a proton, with no more personality than a smudge of blackness. The singularity began taking on serious weight. The mass gauge whirled. Kilograms converted into tons, tons into kilotons. Boulders, hillocks, mountains poured forth, a torrent flowing into the greedy mouth. When Stan was young, they said you weren't supposed to be able to make something from nothing, but nature did sometimes let you borrow. Alex Lustig's machine was borrowing from vacuum and instantly paying it all back to the singularity. That was the secret. Any bank will lend you $1 million, so long as you only want it for a microsecond. Megatons, gigatons. Stan had helped make holes before. Singularities more complex and elegant than this one. But never had anyone attempted anything so drastic or momentous. The pace accelerated. Something shifted in the sinuses behind his eyes. That warning came moments before the gravimeters began singing a melody of alarm. Full seconds in advance of the first creaking sounds coming from the reinforced metal walls. "Come on, Alex. You promised this wouldn't run away." They had come to this lab on a distant asteroid on the off chance something might go wrong, but Stan wondered how much good that would do if their meddling managed to tear a rent in the fabric of everything. There were stories that some scientists on the Manhattan Project had shared a similar fear. What if the chain reaction doesn't stay restricted to the plutonium? They asked. But spreads to iron, silicon, and oxygen. On paper, it was absurd, but no one knew until the flash of Trinity, when the fireball finally faded back to little more than a terrible, glittering cloud. Now Stan felt a similar dread. What if the singularity no longer needed Lustig's machine to yank matter out of vacuum for it? What if the effect carried on and on with its own momentum? This time we might have gone too far. He felt them now, the tides, and in the quartz window, mediated by 300 half mirrors, a ghost took shape. It was microscopic, but the colors were captivating. The mass scale spun. Stan felt the awful attraction of the thing. Any moment now it was going to reach out and drag down the walls, the station, the planetoid. And even then, would it stop? "Alex!" he cried out as gravitational flux stretched his skin. Viscera migrated toward his throat as, uselessly, he braced his feet. "Damn it, you—" Stan blinked. His next breath wouldn't come. Time felt suspended. Then he knew. It was gone. Goosebumps shivered in the tidal wake. He looked at the mass gauge. It read 0. One moment it had been there, the next it had vanished. Alex's voice echoed over the intercom, satisfaction in his voice. "Right on schedule. Time for a beer, eh?" You were saying something, Stan? He searched his memory and somewhere found the trick to breathing again. Stan let out a shuddering sigh. He tried to lick his lips, but couldn't even wet them. Hoarsely, he tried again. I was going to say, you'd better have something up there stronger than beer because I need it. 2. They tested the chamber in every way imaginable, but there was nothing there. For a time it had contained the mass of a small planet. The black hole had been palpable, real. Now it was gone. They say a gravitational singularity is a tunnel to another place, Stan mused. Some people think so. Wormholes and the like may connect one part of space-time with another. Alex nodded agreeably. He sat across the table, alone with Stan in the darkened lounge strewn with debris from the evening's celebration. Everyone else had gone to bed, but both men had their feet propped up as they gazed through a crystal window at the starry panorama. In practice, such tunnels probably are useless. No one will ever use one for transportation, for instance. But there's the problem of ultraviolet runaway. That's not what I'm talking about. Stan shook his head. He poured another shot of whiskey. What I mean is, how do we know that the hole we created hasn't popped out to become a hazard for some other poor bastards? Alex looked amused. That's not how it works, Stan. The singularity we made today was special. It grew too fast for the universe to contain it at all. We're used to envisioning a black hole, even a micro, as something like a funnel in the fabric of space. But in this case, the fabric rebounded, folded over, sealed the breach. The hole is just gone, Stan. Stan felt tired and a little tipsy, but damn if he'd let this young hotshot get the better of him. I know that. All causality links with our universe have been severed. There's no connection with the thing anymore. But still I wonder, where did it go? There was a momentary silence. That's probably the wrong question, Stan. A better way of putting it would be, what has the singularity become? The young genius now had that look in his eyes again, the philosophical one. What do you mean? Stan asked. I mean that the hole and all the mass we poured into it now exists in its own pocket universe. That universe will never share any overlap or contact with our own. It will be a cosmos unto itself, now and forever. 3. After Alex went off to bed, Stan stayed behind and played with his friends, the numbers. He rested very still and used a mental pencil to write them across the window. Equations stitched the Milky Way. It didn't take long to see that Alex was right. What they had done today was create something out of nothing and then quickly exile that something away again. To Alex and the others, that was that. All ledgers balanced. What had been borrowed was repaid, at least as far as this universe of matter and energy was concerned. But something was different, damn it. Before there had been virtual fluctuations in the vacuum. Now, somewhere, a tiny cosmos had been born. And suddenly Stan remembered something else, something called inflation. And in this context, the term had nothing to do with economics. Some theorists hold that our own universe began as a very, very big fluctuation in the primordial emptiness. That during one intense instant, super-dense mass and energy burst forth to begin the expansion of all expansions. Only there could not have been anywhere near enough mass to account for what we now see, all the stars and galaxies. Inflation stood for a mathematical hat trick. A way for a medium or even small-sized bang to leverage itself into a great big one. Stan scribbled more equations on his mental blackboard and came to see something he hadn't realized before. Of course, I get it now. The inflation that took place 20 billion years ago was no coincidence. Rather, it was a natural result of that earlier, lesser creation. Our universe must have had its own start in a tiny compressed ball of matter, no heavier than. Stan felt his heartbeat as the figure seemed to glow before him. No heavier than that little pocket cosmos we created today. He breathed. That meant that somewhere, completely out of touch or contact, their innocent experiment must have, initiated a beginning, a universal beginning. Fiat lux. Let there be light. Oh my God, he said to himself, completely unsure which of 1,000 ways he meant it. With a stunned sensation of irony and wonder, Stan looked out into the blackness through the cold glass. He could not point toward the new thing he had witnessed being born, in effect, his creation. Its blazing destiny now lay beyond all reach in space, time, and dimension. So he chose a direction at random, where a faint scattering distant spirals drifted patiently, and lifted his hand in a gesture of benediction, casting what blessing he could offer into the endless night.